What's up, everybody? Sinister Lex here. Today we're talking about scope creep in your freelance work, talking about freelance, entrepreneurship, business, all that stuff like we usually do. Remember to rate, comment, subscribe, click that get notification bell if you want my notifications. Also remember the free Discord chat in the link in the description below if you want to come chat and hang out, talk freelance. So, scope creep. What is it? How is it affecting you? What can you do to solve it? Scope creep is you have a project you're doing for a client, you've agreed to do a certain amount of work, and then the client starts asking for more things added on to that before they will pay you, so that there's additional parts, there's more, the scope of the job you're doing begins to creep. It's creeping and expanding. That's what scope creep is. So it's when you're going beyond the scope of the work you agreed to do. Yeah, so this causes a lot of problems for freelancers because let's say you sign up to do one thing. You're going to write 7 emails, a 7-email funnel. You agree to write a 7-email funnel for $1,000. They pay you, they put $1,000 in Upwork's escrow, and you get to work on that email funnel. Now it's done, you've sent it over, and they're looking over it. Now they want revisions. That's pretty normal. You know, with any kind of freelance work, you're going to have clients who want revisions. They're going to want to revise things. They're going to say, this sentence doesn't read quite right. We need to adjust something there. Or I want this to be a little bit more direct responsive. That's fine. The problem, or when it becomes a problem, is when the scope starts to creep. So they say, hey, you know, you've written this whole email and that's great and everything, but I'd like to add another section. Or I'd like to add an email onto this. Or we'd like to add something. You're adding things. Or let's take a web design example. You're creating a website, you've built a framework, you say this is what I'm going to build for you, they approve it, and then when it's built, the client comes back and says, hey, we don't know if we like these colors, we want to make it these colors. And you know, you could revise that, that's going to take you some time. So you change the colors and then you send it over, they don't like it, now they want to revise the colors again. Something like that is, you get into this place where it's like, well, how many of these revisions should I do? How many should I do? Because at this point, they're making changes that are, these revisions are not based on things that I've screwed up. They're not based on any error of mine. I've done my job, but the client is asking for revisions based on things such as aesthetics or their personal preferences, which is not something we agreed to. So we agreed that I would send over a proposal, I would send over a framework, and they agreed that that's what they were going to have built. And then after that, now they're coming back with these extra adjustments, and now it's like, well, I can give them those and be nice, but the more you do that, the more they're going to ask for those things. So it's kind of like one of my past videos, it talked about if you give a mouse a cookie effect. When people are asking you, you know, when you give people something for free, they come and they want more and more and more. Well, it's the same thing with scope creep and clients. They have this same issue. If you go ahead and give them those things, they're going to come back and ask for more. And it doesn't have to be web design. It can be copywriting. It can be creating music. It can be just about anything that you could do. There can be elements of scope creep. If you're building an app for somebody and they want to change all these colors, those clients, it gets into scope creep when you're not getting paid for those things, and that becomes a problem for you. So how do you deal with this and how do you handle it? The most obvious way for you to handle scope creep is by addressing it up front. And the times that I have had to deal with scope creep were times where I did not address it up front. So one way to do this is by having a contract with your clients, which usually I promote, and that can be a scope of work contract. You can find templates for this on Google, just different things that you can do. Or, you know, you don't have to have like a contract. If you were in like court or something and you had it in an email or you had it in Upwork and you could prove that the client agreed to your scope of work, then that would be fine. So you could send over something to the client saying, this is the scope of work. You could send this on Upwork, you could send it on email. The point here is that you need to identify the actual scope of work. This is what I'm going to do. This is what it's going to cost. This is what the outcome is going to be, the deliverable you are going to get. Any of these other things are going to be beyond that, and you're going to be charged an additional rate of whatever, your hourly rate or an additional fixed rate. But they need to agree to that up front, and assuming they do that, you're not going to have this problem. You can't possibly have problems with scope creep if you've clearly defined the scope of your work up front. So that's number one. That's the number one thing you can do to avoid this problem. Let's say you've already gotten into a situation where you're now dealing with this problem. So maybe you identified some of the scope of work. Maybe you sent over a proposal that said, I'll do this and this and this for this price, but you didn't identify things such as how many revisions they could have or what constitutes a revision. So now they've sent you 5 or 10 revisions now, but at this point you've gone beyond revisions, because 10 revisions isn't a revision. That's a rewrite, or that's a recreation. You know, if you're in web development and you have to rework a whole bunch of pages, or you have to add a bunch of extra forms or something, those are not revisions, those are additions. We're adding things. So if you go beyond, in my opinion, 2 revisions, then you're definitely expanding the scope of work. And you have to think about it like this. Anytime you do this, anytime you have to go and make revisions for somebody, that means less time you have to work on somebody else's project. So if this client has paid you a fixed rate, you can't work with these other clients on fixed rates because you're still working with this client trying to close out their project. So you need to solve this problem. How are you going to do that? Well, if this is already happening and you can tell that it's starting to get out of hand, the thing you need to do is message your client. You're going to have to message them, and you have to do it in a nice way. You have to say, hey, I can go ahead and make this adjustment and this adjustment, but for these other items, they're kind of beyond the scope of what we described as being the work. So I would have to bill my hourly rate of whatever that is. And I've had to do this pretty recently, just send over something to the clients where it's like, hey, these are aesthetic adjustments you're asking for. These aren't part of the framework. These aren't part of what we agreed to in our initial proposal. And for that reason, we would need to set up a separate contract so that I can bill hourly to make those adjustments. I don't mind making additional color adjustments or little tweaks here and there, but for those kind of things, they take up a lot of time. When I have to go back in and recode a whole website to change the color of a form or to change the color of a section, and I have to do that on every single page, that takes me a lot of time. So I have to get paid for that time, because otherwise I could be working with another client and making that money. The key with this part, though, if you're already in this situation and you have to reach out to a client to let them know you're going to have to bill them additional rates, you have to do it in a way that is very non-standoffish. You don't want to come off as someone who's being standoffish. You don't want to come off as attacking them in any way. You don't want to come off as a douche or being rude. You just want to come off as someone who, hey, I'll make a couple of these adjustments that are within the scope of our work, but for these other ones, I would have to bill a separate amount. If you're okay with that, then go ahead and set up a separate contract, and I can do that for you too, and it's totally fine. You have to always maintain that feeling of comfort for them, because that's what they hired you for in the first place. So you want it to feel comfortable. You don't want to create tension, between the two of you, because that leads to negative feedback, that leads to a bad experience, it leads to bad reviews. What we want to do is maintain control over this situation without letting it expand so far that you're making countless revisions and you're not getting paid for them, and now you're hurting yourself because you can't work with other people and actually make money. You need to get paid for the work you do. Therefore, if the work has already expanded beyond the scope of your project, based on what you initially agreed to and based on what is reasonable, we have to be reasonable here, then you need to follow up with your clients and bill for that additional amount. So that's just my thoughts on this. What do you think? Have you ever ran into this? At what point did you stop? At what point did you put an end to the revisions? And how will you address this moving forward? Will you set up a scope of work contract, or will you just send over something saying, if I were just doing it on Upwork, I'd probably send a message maybe saying scope of work, and then I'd hit the enter key, and then I'd say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to deliver it by this date, here's what I'm going to deliver, and here's how much it's going to cost. And then anything beyond that is going to cost an additional amount. So be thinking about that. I know some of you are dealing with this. Not everyone has. Some of you probably haven't ran into it yet, but you will if you do this long enough. That's my thoughts for this one. Subscribe down below if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Sinister Lex, and I'll see you next time.